Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to our monthly seminar where we contemplate various of the great books. I'm actually in a little Airbnb in Amsterdam. You may have heard about the big storm that's engulfing Western and Northern Europe at the moment. I'm right in the middle of that. Georgie Vajramala in Budapest are also caught up in the storm. And what we'll do today is we're going to be contemplating Anarika Govinda's great work, The Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. We started the meditation last month. We looked really at the great mantra that really undergirds and frames Tibetan Buddhism, the OM MANI PADME HUM. And I will summarize that today. Then I want to touch on the Tibetan Buddhist understanding of the Tantra and also the Chakras. And then finally, the very complex issue of causality and free will. When I finish my remarks, Vajramala, who you will remember from last time, as really some ways the final disciple of Anarika Govinda before he passed, and has been carrying forward his tradition in Germany and various countries in Europe. And she and Georgie met some time ago, and we invited her to comment because she's far more deeply versed in these matters than certainly I am. I'm a mere amateur and seeker, but I never met Govinda. I've only had the privilege of reading his works, and I'm thinking and meditating on the gravity of the great mantra, which has been my mantra since I was a little boy. I told a story last year, last time. So let us begin by remembering the mantra. Om Mani Padme Hum. It's the mantra of the Dalai Lama. It's the mantra that you hear on the lips of virtually every Tibetan, repeating this great mantra all day long. Somehow it's infused in the air, the soil, the buildings, the temples, the culture of Tibet. In some ways, it's synonymous with Tibet. But the mantra obviously is much more ancient than Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. The Om is the universal sound. It's the sound of the cosmos as it beats, the rhythm of life. Om is the syllable in the ancient Vedic tradition that opened and closed many of the hymns and verses in the Vedas and the Upanishad. It is a mirror that reflects the devotion, the humility, the searching, the yearning of every seeker. Om is the great mystery that refracts reality in a way that speaks to every single person who utters the sound in a unique and differentiated way. It's an extraordinary mystery, the sound Om. It's the path of liberation. It's that which ignites infinity inside all of us. Because we all partake, we're all made of infinity. The dust out of which we emerged is the dust of eternity. That is activated by the OM. That's why it's called the path of liberation. It initiates the search. Mani is the great philosopher's stone. It's the elixir that transmutes one thing into another, which was the great mystery and challenge and preoccupation of spiritual teachers and philosophers and scientists from the beginning of time. Everything is one. Everything appears to be different. Everything is changing. What is at the heart of the one, the many, the transformation, such that if you can grasp it, if you can understand it, you can turn lead into gold. You can turn poison into potion. You can turn samsara into nirvana. What is that alchemical elixir out of which transformation emerges? That's the manas. That's the diamond scepter. That's the purba. That's the dream of the alchemist. That which transmutes all our stuff, all our wounds, all our suffering into a higher level of energy, understanding, compassion, and refinement. That's the Mani. Om Mani. It's the path of transformation in this material world. Then remember, we spoke of Padme, and that's symbolized by the lotus flower. That's the path of manifestation. I recall the birth of the Buddha as his mother leaned against a tree and the Buddha dropped out and took 7 steps. And with each step, a lotus blossom emerged under his foot. The lotus blossom is the symbol of the Buddha in many ways. It's the symbol of that which is rooted in the mud at the bottom of the pond and sends a single shoot upwards and then blossoms out, the full lotus at the top of the water. I recall that there are stories of the Buddha that his disciples would rise early around dawn, and they would often see the Buddha levitating in the middle of the pond above a lotus blossom, just contemplating the beauty, the serenity of eternity. That's the Padme. It's that symbol that everything that is, no matter how deeply embedded in the darkness, inexorably will find its way to the light. Every seed starts in the darkness. And unless something untoward happens, every seed pushes its way to the surface of the soil and embraces the light. That's why hope springs eternal. That's why optimism, in the end, transcends pessimism. Because there's something embedded in creation itself, in the depths of the matter within which we live our lives, that yearns, that strives, that desperately seeks the light. That's the lotus blossom. And then the hum. OM MANI PADME HUM. That little sound at the end, often overlooked, but in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, transcends them all. The Om starts the mantra, but the Hum ends the mantra. And I read it last time, but it's just worth reflecting again on this symmetry between the Om and the Hum. The experience of Om must be sheltered and brought to maturity in that of the Hum. Om is like the sun, but the Hum is like the soil into which the sun's rays must descend in order to awaken the dormant life. Om is the infinite, but Hum is the infinite in the finite, the eternal in the temporal, the timeless in the moment, the unconditioned in the conditioned, the formless as basis of all form, the transcendental in the ephemeral. It is the wisdom of the great mirror which reflects the void. We therefore must have passed through the experience of Om in order to reach and to understand the still deeper experience of Hum. This is why Om stands at the beginning and Hum at the end. In the Om, we open ourselves to liberation. The Hum is the door of the realization of the liberation that the Om catalyzes. Why is that? Why does the Hum complete the Om? Because the Hum is the breath. Hum. It's the breath. It's the prana. In the Eastern metaphysical tradition, there's space and there's motion. Hum is the quintessential expression of motion because it is the prana, it's the breathing, it's the breath breathing human beings. And that, to me, is the most profound aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. And that is this notion that we don't dissolve back into the Om. We don't dissolve back into the totality. When we realize who we are in the overall scheme of things and feel the completeness of the individual in the totality. It is the totality, it's the ocean that dissolves into the drop. That's why the hum is such a powerful syllable in the great mantra of OM MANI PADME HUM. It reminds us that in the end, as breath-breathing human beings, our great task is not to dissolve into anything, but to express the totality in the beauty of our individuality. That's the extraordinary depth of the teaching of Tibetan mysticism. I don't know of any religious tradition anywhere that so affirms the individual in relationship to the cosmic totality. Much more can be said about this great mantra, but I'll move on to the various issues that I want to touch on today. And let me start with Tantra. And Tantra means to weave. It's that which knits together. And it's very interesting, you know, that the Tantra was probably embedded in the mind of the Buddha and probably in his secret teachings, but it didn't really rise in the culture of South Asia until about 600-700 years after the Buddha. You may recall that in the immediate aftermath of Buddha, who lived in the 6th century BC, there was the rise of the Theravada Buddhist tradition. And following the Buddha, the teaching was that one leaves ordinary life, goes into a monastery, meditates, and focuses on one's own liberation. No one knows exactly why or how Tantra emerged in the Buddhist tradition. But some scholars believe that it arose out of impatience. Up until the Tantric tradition, there was this general notion that, heck, we're here for thousands and thousands of lives. The Buddha had thousands of lives before he finally became the Buddha. And you remember when he took his 7th step, what did he say? This is my last incarnation. So there was this notion of eternity and reincarnational endlessness. As life after life, you work out your own salvation by accumulating and cleaning out your karma. Then people started to think, well, listen, I don't want to wait that long. How do I, in one lifetime, get to the end of the road? What a challenge. To come out of a whole cosmology of endlessness and say, I want to figure out a way that in one lifetime, I can gain enlightenment. And you know, this was one of the legendary aspects of Milarepa, that he's so focused on enlightenment that he gained it. And the technique that they began to develop was to go precisely into those aspects of reality that the Theravada Buddhists left. You go away into a monastery where everything's comfortable, you get fed whatever your meals, and you're in a community There's a certain timelessness that takes over. But what about if you go out of the monastery and you start sitting in a graveyard, contemplating the corpses? What if you start to drink blood of an animal you just killed yourself? What about if you start having sexual relations, but don't release your semen or your orgasm? What these seekers sought was not disengaging from the opposite, but embracing the opposite. Going to the heart, literally sitting by a stinking corpse as it rotted away, and contemplate existence. Weaving together that which conventional morality says should be ripped apart. Think that thought if you want to experience Tantra. The sexual dimension was one aspect that it came actually much later. It never really infused the Buddhist tradition until it entered into India, into South India. It was a much more drastic, fundamental storming of the citadel of your life, to go into the heart of the poison, go into the heart of everything that you've been told by your culture is outside the bounds, is wrong. Embrace it within the spirit of transformation. The dangers of this, the possibilities of seductions of all kinds, made it so volatile that most of the traditions wouldn't embrace it. Because you start going into the depths of your opposite, to weave the dark and the light together in however it is that it's manifesting to you. And you enter into some very strange alchemical places. But if you can pull it off, if the purity of your intent, if the desperation of your search for enlightenment is so strong, as Jesus said, if your arm offends you, cut it off. If your family offends you, cut them off. Who is my mother? My mother is those who seek the kingdom of God. That's Tantra. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's for the strongest of the strong. Because the higher you go, the farther you fall. So the volatility of the Tantric pathway is quite extraordinary. But if surpassed, can lead to what the Tantric practitioners seek. And that is the enlightenment and the fusing of the lead into gold. That brings us to the issue of the chakras. And I realize I'm just touching and just touching. There's so many other aspects and details of the Tantric tradition, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of really the desperation that gave rise to Tantra. And that's why it's such an extreme art. It is not for the faint-hearted. What the Eastern mystics discovered as they were engaging in the alchemical process of transmuting lead into gold, body into mind, spirit into matter, is the chakras. And I wanted to just read the way that Govinda describes it, because he's so extraordinarily precise in his language. It's one of the reasons why I love Govinda so much, is the precision of his language. It's page 135 in his book, if you have it there. The yogic experience, he said, as they were doing these kinds of things, gaining enlightenment, shows that our brain consciousness is only one among a number of possible forms of consciousness, and that these, according to their functions in nature, can be localized or centered in various organs of the body. These chakras are the points in which psychic forces, and I would add cosmic forces, and bodily functions merge into each other and penetrate into each other. They are the focal points in which cosmic and psychic energies crystallize into bodily qualities, and in which bodily qualities are dissolved or transmuted again into psychic and cosmic forces. The seat of the soul is where the inner and outer world meet. Let's think about that for a moment. We're made of eternity. If you know the physics of Nassim Haramein, the contemporary physicist who, in my estimation, is probably the most brilliant physicist in the world today, worthy of being named the successor of Einstein. And he's putting together a unified field theory in which, if you reduce matter down to its essentials, you get these, what he calls these little Planck entities. Think this thought for a second. You have 100 trillion cells in your body. Each cell has 100 trillion atoms. If you blow up an atom to the size of the basilica at St. Peter's Cathedral, the proton in the middle of the atom would be the size of a grain of sand. If you take this grain of sand and you go to the smallest little integer, these little Planck integers, and you take the Planck integer and blow it up to the size of a grain of sand, the proton would be from here to Alpha Centauri 43 trillion light years away. That's how small these little units are. But the point that Nassim Haramein is making is that these little integers are going from manifest form to unmanifest in 10 to the minus 43 seconds. That's 10 with 43 zeros. You split up a second into 10 plus 43 zeros, you get how fast these things are moving into the void and back into manifest form. Every single aspect of our bodies, every single aspect of everything is moving back and forth, connecting with everything, and then being individually localized in 3 dimensions, and then going back all the time. That's what's connecting the entire universe into what they call in the East the Akashic field. So we're not just little human beings walking around disconnected. We're cosmic beings. We're like antenna. And inside all of our bodies, there's these little vortexes of energies that are connecting us in very specific ways with the totality of everything that is. And each one of these energy centers, starting with our root right there at the perineum, and then the Dantian point, the Hara point, and then our solar plexus, and then our heart, and then our throat, and right in the middle of our brain and our third eye, and then our crown chakra. There's these vortices of energy that are connecting us with everything that is. And we walk around most of our lives completely unaware that we're cosmic antenna. And that the possibilities inherent in our connectedness with everything is missed because we think we're just 3 dimensions. I'm just Jim sitting in Amsterdam, a little cold from the wind outside, giving a lecture. And the extraordinary insight of the Eastern metaphysical tradition is that not only is everything interconnected, OM MANI PADME HUM, everything is transmuting. And if you're desperate enough, you can start knitting the most diverse aspects of reality together in a tantric search for truth and enlightenment. And in the process, you discover, my God, I'm this cosmic tuning device. Imagine the different chakras as different radios or different television sets. You turn the dial and you get certain frequencies. That's happening all the time. You know, they're beginning to discover that plants are receiving cosmic signals from outer space. And that's why astrology is astrology, why it's the oldest and most important science. It quantifies the impact of distant objects on human behavior. And how it's being mediated is through our chakras. It's quite extraordinary. The third eye, for example. Do you know that at the base of the limbic system in your brain is your pineal gland? And the pineal gland is about the size of a grain of rice. That little gland, that chakra point, is what connects you to eternity. That's the third eye. That's how you see without seeing. Between the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, this one little vortice of energy is what connects us equipping us for the kinds of experiences that we need as we turn our base metal into gold. One of the most important meditations one can do is just blessing your chakras. Spending time every day where you literally go chakra by chakra by chakra, honoring it, tuning into it, blessing it, receiving from it. And obviously, most importantly, your heart. You open your heart chakra through gratitude. Just spending 5 or 10 minutes a day, breathing deeply, attuning yourself to your heart, feeling gratitude for everything in your life. It opens these chakras. And the more you open your chakras, the mystics discovered, the more you're activating the capacities that allow you to go from the mud up to the lotus blossom at the top of the pond, top of the water. So your activation of your chakras is an integral aspect of the spiritual process of transformation. Again, much more can be said. I'm sure Vajramala and Georgie and others will have many other points that I could have talked about, but I don't have time for because I want to rush on to this really interesting question of causality and free will. We're in what we do not understand. We're changing all the time. We're desperately seeking to turn our trauma into some kind of transformational experience that will get us to the light. We seem to be beset by causality. Our wounds, our sufferings tie us down. How do we use our free will to get to where we want to go? That is the question with which Govinda concludes this great work. And I want to just read the couple of passages and comment in the remaining time, knowing again that this is an immense issue, unfathomable in every dimension, unanswerable with certitude. But nevertheless, I think his attempt is as gallant as any I've come across. He first makes the point, which I've tried to stress in both lectures now, that the Buddhist teaching does not attempt to deny the importance of differentiation in favor of absolute oneness. We're not just here to go be drops back into the ocean, ladies and gentlemen. On the other hand, it does not strive after the destruction or devaluation of contrasts, but after the recognition of the relativity within a unity existing simultaneously with them, within them, and beyond them. Each phenomenon, each drop, is a unique expression of the whole, unique in its spatial, temporal, and causal position. That's me here in Amsterdam talking to you. I'm in a specific spatial, temporal, and causal position. My job here is not to dissolve anywhere. My job is to connect with the, relationally with the totality, connecting with the void, using my chakras as tuning devices to connect me with the cosmic totality, using the techniques of Tantra, using the techniques of meditation. But it's always as an individual in a particular place and time, manifesting whatever it is that that individual has been able to garner. We therefore can speak of identity. We can neither speak of identity nor of non-identity, neither of existence nor of non-existence with regard to forms of appearance, beings, things, or conditions of life, because everything is relative to everything else. Now, that's a very important point. How it pertains to this question of causality and free will is, according to Govinda, the conflict between law, causality, and free will seems to arise from the over-specialization of one particular center of our consciousness, in which the reflective and egocentric tendencies prevail. By overemphasizing these tendencies, we forget our real nature, lose the connection with other equally important centers, and thus the spiritual balance which is founded on the harmonious cooperation of all our inner forces, all the aspects of the totality, is disturbed. Harmony, as we know it from music, is the best example of an experience in which law and freedom are fused, and in which these expressions lose their contradictory meaning. Causality and freedom aren't opposites. They're part of a complementary whole if they're understood and experienced within the context of harmony. A musician does not feel any compulsion in following the laws of musical harmony. On the contrary, the more perfect he is able to express them in his play or his compositions, the more he feels the joy of creative freedom. He is no more a slave to law, but its master, because he has understood and realized it so profoundly as to become one with the law, and thereby being able to use the law as a creative expression of his own freedom. You know, it's a profound point that he's making, and it reminds me. They say that if you're an ordinary musician, you practice, you know, maybe an hour a day. If you're above ordinary, you practice 2 or 3 hours a day. If you're a master pianist, you're practicing 10 to 12 hours a day. The ones who express the greatest measure of freedom are the ones who embrace the greatest measure of causality, of law. That's an extraordinary thing to just contemplate. An element of freedom, says Govinda, the freedom of choice, therefore, pervades the universe constructed by laws. How better can we describe the fact that from the galaxies to the atom, from the amoeba to the human, every single individual differs from every other individual? How better describe the indeterminacy said to exist within the atom itself, the irregularity of the molecular movement of liquids and gases, the variations of movements of chromosomes, the variability of living organisms, the variation in the modes of giving effect to their instincts by insects and animals of the same species. how better record man's freedom of choice, the sentiment of freedom which we all have within ourselves. The universe is finite, but unbounded. It is controlled, structured, shaped by law. And these laws are all there to contribute to that seed in the mud, germinating and finding its way up to the top of the pond and blossoming as a lotus flower. That is what the law is for. So freedom and causality, choice and law aren't opposites, except when you look at that dichotomy from the point of view of ego and specific frameworks of alienation. Which leads me to the final thing that I wanted to read. That the problem of free will is dissolved in the rays of knowledge. Because will is not a primary quality which can be treated as an independent element, but it is an ever-changing expression of our respective degrees of insight. If this insight is perfect, our will is perfect. If our insight into the true nature of being is in harmony with the forces of the universe, and we are free from the karmic bondage of the past, free from the will that opposes and finds opposition in reality. And he closes with a quote from Rilke. In the perfection of freedom and causality, nothing can happen to us that does not intrinsically belong to us. Or as Novalis puts it, do I not choose myself, all my destinies, since eternity? In the perfection of being, nothing can happen to us that does not intrinsically belong to us. Do I not therefore choose myself, all my destinies from eternity? Thank you, everyone. Those are my thoughts on some of the salient issues that arise out of the great work, the foundations of Tibetan mysticism. Now, Vajramala, I'd like to welcome you to make whatever comments you would like to make on my modest reflections. And then Dr. Zaba, we would love to hear from you. And then you students, I want to hear from all you students. So raise your hands and we'll get to as many of you as we can. Vajramala?
Yeah, thank you for your comment and your interesting reflections about the book, about the mantras and about the chakra systems. I would like to start with the free will. I think our free will is limited a lot by our ignorance, by our greed, by our emotions. So if we would erase these poisons of our mind, then we would really have a free will. And it is a question whether we can speak about a free will as long as we are bound to our desires and aversions. So therefore, the Buddha taught us to work on these bondages so that we really can decide ourselves what we want to do. I think the free will is a big hope, and it is an ideal, but it is not a reality among the general public. Yeah? They feel attracted, they feel seduced. So then I ask, where is the free will? Do you want to make a remark on that, Jody?
Oh, I thought you were going to go on. Yes. Well, you're right. I mean, free will is not the choice between which iPhone you want. Free will is actually much deeper than that. And you're right. As long as people are not on the path,
yes,
they never really discover freedom.
Exactly.
They're consumers seduced into thinking the choice is on whether they're going to get an iPhone 7 or an iPhone 10. Depending on what kind of advertisement has seduced their thought forms. That's not freedom. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So it could be a big aim for us to work on our own mind so that we really will have a free will one day.
Yeah. Yeah, and just like the musician.
With 10 or 12 hours practice.
That's right. They've got to practice for 10 to 12 hours a day for years, and then they discover freedom.
Exactly. Exactly.
Then when they've mastered the law,
yes,
they discover freedom.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Very good point.
As long as we are students or beginners and are not still the master of our own mind, we are bound very much. I also would like to make a comment on the topic of causality. Lama Govinda was very much concerned rather to speak of this interdependency, because a causality often is regarded as linear cause and effect. But in Buddhism, we speak about the millions and milliards of conditions which come together in a single point, in a single moment, and create a momentary situation, a momentary object, a momentary encounter. And then again, after a few moments, everything dissolves again and new influences can be observed. So if we don't understand this causality in a linear way, but in this multiple interconnectedness and influences, then we are living within a net of conditions. And I remember a very beautiful saying of Lama Govinda, who said that we are I can't quote it in English probably, we are the meeting point of thousands of
you can see it in German.
In German?
Gero can translate it.
Okay, wait a little. Wir sind der Schnittpunkt unzähliger Energien des Universums, from moment to moment.
Yeah, it's something like we're the center point of countless energies of the universe, moment by moment.
Yes. Yeah. And that is very close to that what you told in the beginning. Yeah? That within every individual, we find the whole universe. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And we have to unfold this universality in every individual personality. And that's so beautiful what you told today. Yeah. I would like to add a few points concerning the book for the readers. It is not only a book about the mantra OM MANI PADME HUM, it is also a book about the basic Tantric system of the 5 Buddha families. So if you will read this book, you will get an impression of the whole of the system, which is, so to say, the basis of the later unfolding Tantric systems, which are manifold and quite diverse. And without this understanding, it is very difficult to understand this Tantric reality. So I only can encourage the students to read this book in a way. You, Jim, have exactly mentioned it in your first sentence when you said contemplating the book. So please don't read it, but contemplate on every sentence, and then it will be an adventure and enrich your life. Every sentence is important, and on every sentence you can meditate. Mm-hmm. Just reading it is not enough, but in case somebody is only reading it, perhaps he will read it again in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years and will discover many, many other details and interesting points to reflect on.
Well, thank you. Those are very good observations. I would like to ask you a question, Bhadramala. In your tradition, what is your particular accentuation in terms of the tantric aspects of the spiritual path? How do you use the tantric process, or is that not something that is particularly useful to you and your community?
It is very useful. First, our members are mostly lay people who are working, have a job, have a family life. So to integrate this everyday life into their practice is very important.
Yeah, that's an aspect of Tantra.
Yes, yeah. Very, very special feature of the Tantra. On the other hand, this renunciation, what we call renunciation in the early Buddhism, or also in Theravada, for example, this ethics of avoiding unwholesome deeds is interpreted in a different way in the Tantric tradition. So in the Tantric tradition, renunciation is not a way of avoiding, but of committing yourself completely to awakening in every situation, in every age, in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. And not to avoid problems, not to avoid hindrances, not to avoid difficulties, but to go through them. So in our tradition, it is perhaps very special that we combine the practice and the studies our studies are also regarded as a sort of meditation, not only as an intellectual procedure. I was very happy when you started your lecture with this sentence, to contemplate the book, to contemplate every teaching of the Buddha, to meditate on every mantra. And the whole book is, so to say, the outcome of Lama Govinda's meditation on this mantra. But on the other hand, we start quite traditionally in our tradition with the Tantric practice by the preparatory exercises, which are practiced in all the traditions. In the Buddhist tradition, they call it Lamrim. In the new traditions, they call it Ngandro. And they include a lot of preparatory purification practices. They include to take refuge, to develop bodhicitta. We start with the Vajrasattva practice. We try to show the importance of the offering practices in the mandala offering, and then in a very deep way try to understand what is Guru Yoga, not only to venerate a teacher, but to search the Buddha within, to search our own Buddha nature. So the content which we study and practice is quite traditional. The approach is a modern approach. We try to find a modern language so that people in the West can understand. We use modern examples, modern images or pictures to make it understandable. And what is my favorite way to teach, to integrate, for example, the etymology into the explanations, because it is very problematic to use words which have been translated into a Western language without knowing the root of the term which is behind. Yeah? If you say enlightenment, it doesn't hit the point. It is not enlightenment, it is an awakening. So we have to meditate very deeply on these old traditional terms to find out what the Buddha and the Tantric masters really meant.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point.
And these terms also changed during the centuries. Yeah? The same word in the 2nd century has not necessarily the same meaning in the 8th or 12th century.
Exactly.
Or in the different traditions, they have also different wording. And it's quite difficult to study all these differences. And yeah, we are in the beginning. There's still much to do for the Westerners.
We have a long way to go.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I think we'll go now to you, Georgie, have a comment. And then I noticed that Anne Baring is with us. I don't know whether, Anne, you want to make a comment after Georgie. And then the various students, I'd love for all the students to raise their hands one way or another, and so that we can have a discussion on these matters. But Georgie, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, thank you, Jim. Well, thank you so much for your very rich, passionate, and amazing lecture. It's always wonderful to listen to you. And as you say, that the free will and determination is a great subject in classical philosophy. So we can run a course on it forever, really. But when I was actually thinking about it, 2 things came to me. One of which is that when I'm thinking with my ego mind, I really delude myself that I have a free will. When I'm in meditation, I care nothing about free will. So it's really kind of like really finding that the Buddhist middle way that I combined these two, but great aspects. But actually, I know that you don't have much time, but there are two things I'd like to read from the book. One is a question, but the other is, as you say, Jim, the Govinda writes so exquisitely that it's poetry to the heart. And what you, Jamal, were just saying, or the responding to Jim's question, I found this passage that I'd like to read to you because it's so relevant to your comments. So this is what he said. The primordial creative power of life is blind without the power of knowledge, of conscious awareness, and becomes an endless play of passions in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, samsara. The power of knowledge without the unifying primordial force of life turns into the deadly poison of intellect and demonical principle aiming at the annihilation of life. Where, however, these two forces cooperate, penetrating and compensating each other, there arises the sacred flame of enlightened mind, bodhicitta, which radiates light as well as warmth, and in which knowledge grows into living wisdom, and the blind urge of existence and unrestrained passion into the power of universal love.
Great.
Wow. No comment. But now I have a question for you, dear Vajramala. And this actually puzzled me. There are lots of puzzling things within the book, but we are limited in time. So this is to do with page 38. Govinda says, the Buddha himself would have expressed his teachings in a different way if he had lived in the 6th century AD, instead of in the 6th century BC. And this was not because of Dharma or the truth which he had to teach would have been a different one, but because those who were to be taught had added to their consciousness 12 centuries of historical, practical, mental, and spiritual experience, and had not only a greater store of concepts and possibilities of expression, but also a different mental attitude with different problems and perspectives and different methods of solving them. So if Sakyamuni Buddha was living nowadays, how would he convey his message differently to those he did?
I think he also would see the needs of our everyday life, of our modern life. He would see the overwhelming greed of the people. He would see the even growing tendency to power, exploitation, the cruelty of people. And probably he wouldn't go so deeply into philosophy or meditation, but also would deal with practical actions which we would have to do.
For example?
For example, on Sunday there was an initiative to do prayers and meditations for a vegan life, to reflect on the suffering the mankind commits towards the animals. And I think there was a very respected Lama. He passed away in the meantime in the Trikunkaji tradition, who only went from village and center to center and propagated only one wish and one teaching: don't eat meat anymore. Because you know, the Tibetans like very much to eat meat. And in nomad tradition, that is quite understandable, as it was in Tibet. But under our present situation and conditions, it is not only to eat meat, it is the question how we treat the animals, how we misuse them, how we torture them, how we keep them, and how this production of sentient beings for our own luxury produce a huge amount of pollution. Yeah? So that somebody said, I remember, if the insects will die out, the mankind will survive still perhaps 20 years. If mankind would die out, the world again would flourish. So perhaps that would also be a message of a Buddha in modern times.
Yeah.
There's
one word, compassion.
Yeah.
Thank you. And even actually those tribes, Aborigines, for example, when they ate meat, they always made a ritual. They had a connection with the animal. So
and they never took more than they really needed.
Exactly.
Yeah. But we take it for our luxury, what is not necessary. Yeah. There are many, many other possibilities, and we cause so much damage to the world. Yeah. We not only kill the animals, we also destroy the forests, yeah, which are the basis for
totally
healthy environment. Yeah, and I think if a awakened Buddha would live today, he would say, first step, do this homework, and then you can go and meditate, or meditate on your situation, meditate on the suffering of these sentient beings who are dependent on you.
Thank you. Back to you, Jim.
Okay, good. Listen, I'm just gonna, is Laura Madsen. Linda White, get set. Anne, did you want to say anything?
There is a sign that somebody wants to
say. Anne, and then Stefan raised his hand. So we'll have Anne, you can bring her on, Georg, and then Stefan.
Both coming up.
Perfect. Anne, how are you? Is she muted, Georg?
Yeah, she has muted herself right now. Let's see. And there she is.
There we go.
Yeah, very quickly, because I know there's not much time. I just want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart, because it means so much to me to hear Jim speak like that, to explain everything so wonderfully, and also to hear the comments of the person who really worked with Govinda. I've had that book in my library since 1950, and I'm reading The Way of the White Clouds now, which I'm finding fascinating.
Beautiful.
And I think free will from my life was just simply following the path which I felt I had to follow. That was the free will that I had, the small amount. And Jung said, we are partly fated and partly free. And the measure of our freedom is to be able to relate to our fate. I think they're very profound words. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you so much, both of you.
Well, that's another way of putting, I think, Govinda's point. There's a certain law to our being. There's a certain law to our destiny, and you tracked your destiny path and you discovered your freedom. You know, It's sort of like Jesus at Gethsemane, not my will, but thine be done.
That's right.
It's our capacity to subordinate to a higher law, a higher fate that really is the pathway of authenticity. That's a very good point.
I had a great deal of help.
Yes. And the way of the White Cloud is just as poetic and almost ethereal as the foundation of Tibetan mysticism is dense, you know, and full of kind of gravitas.
That's right. Thank you anyway. I'll withdraw now.
Thank you. Thank you. Always good to have you on the call. Stefan.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. In advance, I'm going to ask for pardon for the layman terms that I'm going to try to formulate a kind of like a double question in one. So my question was, actually it's almost, was very similar to Georgie's. I hope my internet connection's okay. I'm just wondering about if there's an evolution from the genesis of these truths, of these sacred truths. Since from my understanding and my experience, everything's always changing. I'm just wondering, since Tibetan Buddhism and mysticism is very ancient and it's from such a different culture, I'm wondering if there's maybe perhaps like parallel truths to these that would be more, I'm trying to ask this in the right way, that might be updated for us, because I was really having a difficult time trying to understand, because at certain, I did read everything, and at certain moments it seems like that the individual is like obliterated, but then it seems like in a sense we become this cosmic individual. And then I started wondering if there's not the cosmic individual, like myself, not the ego, but my true self, how would I be able to contemplate anything? How would I, like, who becomes the meditator? I just got really into these kind of questions. So I'm wondering, I don't know if that's actually cohesive or not. I'm sorry, I tried to wrap two questions in one. Okay, I'll condense it. Could it be that the truth changes, and then who is it that's contemplating? I'll leave it at that. Sorry.
Well, I mean, those are two very profound unanswerables, I think.
Okay, good.
You know, we're in a situation, Stefan, as Georgie's question was pointing to, if the Buddha came back, what would he say? And how would he say it? Because context shapes content. If you take two contemporary mystics, for example, Francis of Assisi in the Catholic West and Jalaluddin Rumi in the Islamic East, both powerful mystics, but the shape of their mysticism, the way they experienced their mystical awareness, was sculpted by their time, their place, their language, and their culture. And I think the Buddha was 2,600 years ago in northern India. And what he would be like, who he would be, and how he would be in 21st century USA under Trump is a real question about how he would refract the truth that is eternal. I mean, one of the teachers that I'm most fascinated by right now, for example, is Joe Dispenza. If you haven't heard of Joe Dispenza, you should get on his website, because in my estimation, Joe Dispenza is the first post-axial teacher. The Buddha, Hinduism, Taoism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Confucianism were all formed with civilization, patriarchy, the negation of women, the negation of the flesh, the negation of the earth. All of them. The Buddha. The Buddha had to be asked 3 times to allow women into the community. And he resisted. And finally he relented and then made one of the most sexist things I've ever heard. He said the highest nun is lower than the lowest monk. Right? That was the Buddha. None of the axial teachers, Jesus, and none of them had any problem with slavery. Jesus never spoke out against slavery. The Buddha didn't. They were bound by their time. And one of the things that I think our generation is wrestling with is that we're emerging beyond the axial traditions as we globalize, but we haven't yet globalized our spirituality. And, you know, for example, Anne's last book, The Dream of the Cosmos, you can feel in Anne's mind wrestling with how do you rework traditions shaped by modalities of being that are no longer even ethical in the contemporary world. And how do you then glean onto the truth? And one of the things that Joe Dispenza is doing is he doesn't reference any of the traditions, because his conclusion is that science is now the contemporary language of mysticism. And because of that, because he's not trying to recover the language of any of the mystical traditions or any of the religious traditions, he's providing people with a fresh, direct way of experience timeless truth in such a powerful way that people are being healed by the hundreds and hundreds. He's the first spiritual teacher that I know of whose events sell out within minutes. I tried to get into his event in Vienna in May, and I think 1,500 tickets were sold out in 15 minutes. I was too late. Now, one of the reasons for this is this question that Georgie's posing and that you're posing. If you try to apply the teachings of a man who lived 2,500 years ago, now, the pathway to recover that language, as you were saying in trying to even read Govinda's book, it's so dense. And the language in some ways is so archaic, you've got to really contemplate it. And the Buddha of today will be a person, in my view, who is so direct and so fresh that people experienced something they've never experienced before, because there's no barriers to the pathway of spiritual awakening. I don't know of anybody, certainly in our lifetime, that is now generating mass healings. And I'll be talking about Dispenza's book, one of his big books. I'm doing Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil in March and April, but May and June, I'm going to be doing Joe Dispenza's work. And then we're going to be using Joe Dispenza quite a bit during our time in Gramatica in July in Chartres. because there's a certain catalytic quality that I think all of us are aspiring to as we try to determine what is eternal in a world that is now completely disconnected from the past. Knowledge is speeding up so fast now. We hit an inflection point in 2007. And anyone who wants to if you haven't read Harari's book, Species, and Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, I would definitely read these books. Our world we're not in Kansas anymore. And all the axial religions were shaped in Kansas. And one of the reasons why the world is so confused, in my opinion, is because the language of the past is no longer relevant to human beings today. And that's why the religions are less and less effective in the transformational process. And this is something I would just say in terms of ubiquity and in terms of the wisdom school. How do we keep up with an escalating reality? And so Georgia, you asked a very, very profound question. And Stefan, you have really nailed it in a secondary way. So I just wanted to honor it by indicating the gravity of this question. And I think our generation is challenged to break through to the other side. And most of the religions are still trying to do both. They have their one leg on one side of the river, one leg on the other side of the river. Joe Dispenza's completely broken through. And people are just flocking to him. Like I've never seen anybody, certainly in my lifetime. Most of us are nowhere near his level of clarity. And I think that's presenting a challenge that all spiritual teachers are going to have to grapple with. And let me close on this, because I think the Dalai Lama and the disposition of the Dalai Lama is an example of the complexity of these questions that the two of you have posed. Since the 12th century, the Dalai Lama has kind of trundled along, one incarnation after another, and did it 13 times. Fine. They were contained by a culture that enabled that. And then came the Communist Revolution in China. And in 1950 and in 1951, the year I was born in China, so I was engulfed at my birth in the Chinese invasion of Tibet. I was born right on the border of Western Sichuan province and Tibet. Communists came in and they killed off 10% of the population. My mother gave birth to me all by herself because the communists had killed the doctor. The Dalai Lama fled some years later, 1959. He's been in exile. The Chinese have crushed the Tibetan Buddhists. What is the Dalai Lama talking about now? Maybe this is the last incarnation. Context shapes content. Francis, Rumi, same generation, completely different mysticisms. What is the future of Tibetan Buddhism if it doesn't have Tibet? What is the future of religion when science can now explain almost everything? How does our generation, on the precipice of annihilation through climate change and a range of other issues, how do we fashion what it even means to be spiritual in the face of the extinction of our species? These are questions that have never had to be asked before. And as Harari says, it's our lack of appreciation of the qualitative shift in state of our species and our clinging to past ideologies that is at the center of our predicament. So that may have been a little lengthy answer or comment. There's no answers, there's only comments on these matters to Georgie and Stefan's questions, everyone, but this is profound. Our generation may be the generation that witnesses the demise of Tibetan mysticism, unless Tibetan mysticism can radically reformulate itself. And this is the challenge that the Dalai Lama is offering to us. What does the Dalai Lama mean if reincarnation no longer happens? Do you elect the Dalai Lama? Does the Chinese Communist Party determine the Dalai Lama? Then is he still the Dalai Lama? The radical shift of context requires a radical shift of content if the content is going to be relevant to the newly formed context. I emphasize this because this is what Nietzsche is all about. And so next month, we are going to contemplate Nietzsche's great masterwork, written after Thus Spake Zarathustra, where he grappled precisely with this question. So Vajramala, I want to thank you very much on behalf of us all for everything that you've contributed over these last two seminars. We wish you all the best in Lake Constance and in your community. Georgie, thank you for bringing Vajramala into our midst. Thank you, Anne, as always, for everything that you represent in our community. And I'll, since we are off, we have exceeded our time. Raquel and Seema will get your questions next time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim. Bye.
Bye-bye.